So thank you very much, Glenn and Eric Posner, for having us here. I guess at that point I should say I'm delighted to be here, but for the moment I'm just impressed, so I hope delight comes next. So this conference is about evaluating the promises of a new model for decision-making that is quadratic voting. So as we understand, you've spent the past years studying theoretical properties of these models and demonstrating efficiency, for instance, and now the promises to be evaluated are more about the applicability of this decision-making process to American society and public bodies and private bodies. So for us historians, this is quite an interesting moment because this has already happened in the past. Economists has already been in that situation of devising collective decision mechanism and trying to apply them to American society. And I've been debating problems of efficiency versus democratic legitimacy. So we thought it would be an interesting contribution to the discussion here to actually relate how economists got interested, why and how economists got interested in collective decision after World War II. Historians of science approach to this problem has been more to argue that economists got interested in rational decision-making, both individual and collective, as a way to defend capitalist American society against the Soviet threat. Our perspective is a bit different. It's nice to have economists pictured as world philosophers, but we argue instead that the interest in collective decision-making stems from economists' increasing and more systematic involvement with the policy process. So a first problem we have in that project is that collective decision is a very elusive concept. No economists define collective decision the same way. For some, it's just voting, and for others, it's just all economics is basically about collective decision. So that's the first problem. Then you got the problem of market versus non-market decision making. For some economics, collective decision making is the study of non-market decision making. This is how public choice initially called themselves, called their journal, and called their society. And if you include both market and rather political types of collective decision, make it within the scope of economists, do you oppose one to another, or is it the same stuff? Here you have a quote from the opening quote from Arrow 51 social choice and welfare paper, and it says, in a capitalist democracy there are essentially two methods by which social choice can be made: voting and the market mechanism. And then here you have a quote from a letter Samuelson sent to Musgrave when he was commenting on a draft of his theory of public finance. So in the late 60s, and in the late 50s, and what Samuelson said to Musgrave is, here again, you start out almost in a teleological way, presuming that there is something natural and optimal about the market mechanism, so that everything else can be measured in terms of its closeness of result to the market. I reverse the emphasis and consider the market mechanism as one special kind of voting system. Okay? So you have all different ways to organize thinking about collective decisions, the market versus collective decision. Then you can say, oh, but definition is simple. There is one JL code category that is called collective decision. But here again, there is a story to that. The way this collective decision category was framed in the JL code, it happened in a revision that happened in '88 by the editor of the Journal of Economic Literature back then, John Pencavel. So what he initially thought is about putting some various collective decision mechanism in the microeconomic category, like game theory, non-cooperative game theory at one place, cooperative game theory at another place, provision of public good elsewhere, and stuff like that. And then Gordon Tullock writes a letter saying, this is downgrading public choice and collective decision research. Before it was a standalone category, and now it's spread all throughout the microeconomic category. We're a community, we want our own code. So Pencavel goes to Rogenol and say, we have a problem here. How can we do that? And so Rogenol proposed to establish a category composed of social choice, economic model of political process, public sector, bureaucracy, and policy analysis of macroeconomic policymaking and microeconomic policymaking. Then you have to find a name, and that's a problem. So he says, we can't name it public choice because we don't want to have any association with Buchanan and Tullock ideology. That's what he says. We can call it public economy because it's too Marxist. We can call it public economics because this is the way we frame our thinking at Caltech and Stanford. So it would look like we're trying to advance our own program. We're going to take the word collective decision that is not very used, that is neutral, and I will go for anything. So this anecdote shows you actually how elusive that notion of collective decision making is in economics. So now our purpose here is not to bring order to all this. We're not philosophers. Rather, it is to understand why economists got interested in these topics and why, if so, it remains something elusive, always here, but not always at the forefront of economic thinking. This varies across time. So one simple way to frame this is to say that there's been economist supply of model and mechanism, and that it met or didn't met demands for collective decision thinking. So economist supply of model mechanism that you know about, from social welfare function to preferential valuation mechanism. There is a technical side to that, but it also feds into the way economists perceive society and their role in policy making. If you look at the late 30s, for instance, for Musgrave, studying the scale of values is not something for economists. This is for psychologists. If you read Samuelson's famous paper on the provision of public good in '54, he says also that the study of value is something for political scientists and sociologists. And on the other hand, if you read Stigler, that writes a short, terrible paper in '41 in which he says basically that new welfare economics is bullshit, he says, I urge economists to go more into applied ethics, as they call it. They should do it. So to begin with, if economists are interested in collective decision making, they have to make the topic legitimate. It was not a legitimate topic at the beginning, right? And then you have the demand side. The demands for collective decision mechanism comes from government agency, the military, foundation, the private sector, and they have an ideological dimension, what the state, for instance, can and cannot do, and they also have a technocratic dimension. What's a good way to make, what's an adequate tool for this collective decision making, okay? So what we're going to do here is to tell you, to explain that there were 4 periods in which that economic supply and public demands met or didn't met throughout the post-war period.
So at the time, before the post-war period, economists considered that the determination of the value guide in government intervention was outside of the scope of economics, as Beatrice told us. You can find here and there discussions about that topic. Should economists engage in that topic? And if they should, what should be those values underpinning government intervention? Should it be something like consumer sovereignty, or should it be some transcendental values? You find also a few works trying to ground the state decisions as ground state decision in individual preferences, and that's the work of Musgrave, for instance, who is trying to build an integrated view of public finance and try to build that around the notion of a voluntary exchange relationship between the individual and the state. But eventually, that is in the late 1930s, this approach is discarded because it's not practical, it's not useful for policy making. And it becomes even more rejected some way during the war because of the war effort and the preoccupations at the time. And so most economists during the war would consider that there is 2 separate domains. One is the determination of social objectives, and the other domain is how to get to this social objective through planning, through markets. And so the quote by Musgrave here shows you that he consciously will neglect the first domain of analysis and focus on economic stabilization and planning. So economists from that period worked with the social value scale as given, which is also illustrated by Bergson's social welfare function, which takes the preferences as given. So after the war, the context changes a little bit, and things are a bit different. The level of government intervention reaches unprecedented level in peacetime, much more important level than during the New Deal. In the meantime, the economist holds a very important position as policy advisor. This position is institutionalized in 1946 with the creation of the Council of Economic Advisors. And in the meantime, economists know that they cannot work in a totally value-free environment. They have to work with values. Their attempts to work on a theory where there would be really almost no value judgments. I'm thinking about the new welfare economics, which offered to think and to think in terms of how to compare different policy outcomes without interpersonal comparisons of utility. Well, this framework is deemed by economists as useful for concrete policy making. So economists have to reluctantly acknowledge that they have to work with values, like with the social welfare function. They take the social values as given. But the problem is, it's a context, the post-war context, where there are strong pressure pushing for value-free analysis and a lot of suspicions regarding value-laden analysis. A first kind of pressure comes from McCarthyists and also skeptics of government intervention. So economists are under attack, sometimes by economists, because they are perceived as having a bias towards government intervention. Another pressure for a value-free analysis comes from the changing scientific context, especially regarding the funding of science. A lot of the new big players in the funding of economics, that is philanthropic foundations and public agencies, military agencies, are calling for value-free analysis. An interesting example is given by the creation of the National Science Foundation, which was supervised by physicists. And the idea of creating a social science division was rejected. And the reason was that physicists didn't believe that economists were capable of producing value-free analysis. So one way out of this sort of dilemma for economists was to say, look, we might take values as given, but those values reflect some form of consensus. A consensus within American society, a consensus, most importantly, within the economic community. People from broad and different spectrums, from Friedman to Musgrave to Samuelson, share similar views about what are the proper ends for society, that is minimum freedom and economic freedom, high employment, and some form of stability of the price level. So relying to that kind of consensus about the ends of policy is still unsatisfactory to a number of economists and even political scientists from broad and different perspectives, which really are pushing for the conceptualization of the collective value scale as deriving directly from individual preferences. There's a quote from James Buchanan, for instance, who claims that state decisions are, in the final analysis, the collective decisions of individuals. So a very few number of economists in the late 40s and during the 50s will work on preference aggregation and collective decision making, pioneering analysis by Duncan Black, Arrow, Samuelson, Buchanan also, although he will not really model collective decision at the time. He will raise interesting problems that have been raised today. Very early on in this literature, a number of theoretical impossibilities arise. Obviously, there is Arrow 1951 and the impossibility theorem, but also, in a way, Samuelson 1954 paper about public finance, which basically says that people may lie about their true preferences for a public good. So if you want to have a collective decision that reflects individual preferences, it will be difficult. What is interesting is that even if there are important and very fundamental impossibility and theorems and problems in the literature at the time, economists, even if they disagree about the problems and the solution, will also rely on this notion of consensus, which seems to be in the 1950s somewhat a timely notion. Arrow, for instance, will say, okay, there is a paradox, but is it that important? Because people eventually share a significant amount of similarities, so it may not be as problematic as one might think. Buchanan has a very particular view of the public good problem, and he really doesn't believe Samuelson. He believes that people will voluntarily contribute to the public good, and they are able to reach a consensus simply by talking to each other. So he's a bit lonely on that, but it's interesting to see that there is this notion of consensus that exists at this time. So in the 1950s, collective choice, the notion that collective choice should be based on individual value really takes off. We have obviously the literature reacting to Arrow and all the social choice literature that is being created at the time. But also this approach is disseminated in other subfields such as public finance. Here there's a quote from Richard Musgrave, who will publish a very influential book in 1959 in public finance, who says, okay, I have changed my mind. In the 30s, I thought that it was not possible to create this voluntary exchange relationship theory. And now that I'm seeing Arrow and Black and all these studies of collective decision making, I really believe that not only it's possible, it's very important. So it's not possible to neglect how does he say that, how social preferences scales are determined. But Musgrave is also somewhat still a product of the 50s because to solve the problem of aggregation, he basically says, well, there is majority voting, and majority voting is quite optimal. It works very well. People are not that different. They agree on fundamental values, and so we should use majority voting to solve this problem. Things are changing in the 60s and 70s, especially with the development of the literature, the public choice literature and public choice community, thanks to the work of Buchanan, Tulloch, and others at the University of Virginia and other places. And the development of this public choice literature will really provide a different vision of majority voting, a different vision of democratic institutions, a rather more negative vision of those collective decision mechanism in which the appeal to consensus will be less and less and less possible. Even Buchanan's constitutional economics will shift from a position where it's possible people will reach a consensus on the constitutional rules for a society, and as the 60s are going, he will be less and less confident in that. So eventually, this literature shows that, well, there's heterogeneity of motivation among agents, and the collective decision procedure failed to reflect fully the preference of individuals because institutions are controlled by rent-seeking people, bureaucrats, or because there are problems of tyranny of the majority over the minority, and so on and so forth. And this leads, obviously, to a new way to criticize government intervention, because from now on, it's not possible to call on the government and say that the government should correct market failures, because if you rely on collective decision processes, it has a cost, and this cost should be compared to the cost of the initial market failure. So this is what Dennis Muller will conclude in his review survey paper of 1976, that it's a rather negative picture of collective decision making. What's interesting is that the development of these theories happen in a very particular context the 1960s in the US is also a context where consensus is less and less and less possible within the population. There's some conflict within, between the generations, there are racial tensions, there are urban riots, student protests, and so on and so forth. And what's interesting is that in such a context, the government again expands in its scope of intervention with the Great Society and war and poverty. And the economist will also be required to provide leading advices and guidance on those programs. And the Great Society and War and Poverty will really try to sell a vision of public policy that is rationalized, value-free, with the PPBS notably, but with the development of policy analysis, cost-benefit analysis. And so what is difficult is that the economist is facing problems at the theoretical level, but he has to act, and he has to act on a larger scale because of the government intervention, which really is expanding at the time. And so the dilemma is still not solved for economists.
So we are in that position, in that paradoxical position in the 60s, where on the one hand, they are really pressing demands. I mean, there are demands from the government for urban renewal, for transportation policy, for water resource management, for education policy, and all that stuff very, very quickly. I mean, the Ford Foundation is putting millions of dollars into research projects saying we need results now. And on the other hand, you had all sorts of theoretical impossibilities and debates as to whether economics theories actually reflects actual decision mechanism. So what economists do in this year is that they turn to different types of tools, tools basically based on optimizing an objective function, like operational research, system analysis, linear programming, and cost-benefit analysis. And you would think that cost-benefit analysis is more like straightforward. It's about evaluating the costs and benefits, and that you aggregate them, and then if there is a net benefits, you implement the policy, or if it's a continuous decision, you compare the marginal cost and marginal benefits. And what is interesting for our purpose is that the problem of collective decision doesn't go away with applying this set of techniques. You see this, I'm going to give you 3 examples. The first example is that conference that takes place in Biarritz in 1955 under the leadership of Margolis and Guiton, and 65, sorry. And so this will be one of the first volumes with the title Public Economics, published in 1969. And from the proceeding of the conference, so the conference brings together theorists like Sen, Samuelson, Marsgrave, and also practitioners from France, from Britain, from the US, and also from the USSR. And what you see from the proceeding is that the big elephant in the room is this: the search for an operational objective function. And what grounds, where does that operational objective function that you have many, many techniques to optimize come from? And so Margolis sums it up in the introduction by saying the approach most common to the literature of economic theory is the aggregation of individual preferences. A less rigorously stated approach, which is found more frequently in practice, is a social ordering expressed by the government. And he went on to say there is debate in that room between practitioners and theorists. And if you consider that the political process is actually a good representation of individual preference, then that's the same. And if you don't, then these 2 mechanisms are really different. And they can't settle on any good practice for practitioner. A second example is what happened in urban renewal. That is one of the most and the biggest project that occupies economists and social scientists in the 60s. So if you look at textbook designed to evaluate urban renewal policies, for instance, a famous textbook by Rothenberg, who is a welfare economist at MIT in these years. He says, it's really a textbook on how to practically evaluate urban renewal policies. And he says, we need aggregation over groups of individuals. So he looks for a procedure to aggregate over groups of individuals, but he looks for a type of aggregation that has normative significance as well. So he's not giving up on that. And what it says is that it wanted types of aggregation that mimics a representative democratic process. So what it does is actually wants to select weight for his cost-benefit function that actually replicates the influence various group of interest has at the parliament by saying, well, this is like doing so that my cost-benefit function actually is a reflect of a representative democracy. So it kind of finds some way to actually relate the practices of what it is doing to a collective decision process that it finds acceptable. One third example is a debate that is going on water resource management. In the late 60s, there is huge debate at the parliament to reform water resource management processes, and you got two sets of economists fighting. One group is economists at Harvard, water resource management at Harvard, that are led by Otto Eckstein. And what they advocate is basically a kind of multi-objective cost-benefit analysis. They say in water resource management, the objectives are irreconcilable. So it is trying to aggregate not over groups of people, but other objectives. And it says this is irreconcilable. Okay, do you want to advance food production, regional development, protection from floods, health? And it says in no event should the technician arrogate the weighing of objective to himself by presenting a one-dimensional answer after burying the weighing process in a wealth of technical details. So what it advocates is that economists returns to the parliament with a set of metrics in which you have the cost and benefits for various types of objective, and you leave it to the parliament or the commission or whatever to aggregate, because it's not the task of the economist to do that aggregation. And another set of economists at the Resource for the Future, people like Havman, Myrick, Friedman, for instance, they say no. The economist is allowed to do the weighing and aggregation. And in discussing this, they say, well, because, you know, the parliament, it's all about, quote, pork barrel log rolling and empire building. So the economist is just as good as the policy or the politician to do that aggregation. So you see here various, various ways of talking about collective decision. So all this change, so you get a kind of schizophrenia between economists doing theoretical work and applied work, and this change widely in the 70s and 80s. I'm going to go faster because you know all this. Impossibilities are being resolved. Since you got to work with a larger informational basis, otherwise you're never going to actually come out with interesting results. So this is one impossibility resolved. The second impossibility was Samuelson impossibility. And so the Vickrey-Clark-Ledyard mechanism is a way to say we can actually provide public good in an efficient way. And market designer are also in the same institutional setting, that is Purdue, Northwestern, Caltech, etc., trying to think about a game decision mechanism that will be efficient. And what is actually interesting is that all this ties together with thinking a way of implementing the theory directly. And the rise of experiment actually enables economists to take these new theoretical ideas, to test them first in the classroom and then in the lab, and to implement them directly. So you have a theory that is made consistent with new types of application, new mechanism for application. And this actually happens at the time a new kind of demands for collective decision mechanism emerged, what is called the deregulatory movement. You get a quote here from Miller, that is Ford's policy advisor, and an economist at Ford's policy advisor. I'm not saying that all government regulation is bad, but the evidence we do have on the effect of social regulation suggests that the costs are enormous and in many cases overwhelm any reasonable estimates of benefits. So there is a new demand. For instance, you get the Air Deregulation Act in the late 70s, and this creates new demands for new mechanisms that actually are more kind of emulate market mechanism. And you have, for instance, a plot that is conceiving new mechanism to allocate takeoff and landing slots, or to allocate resources in space station, or to induce preference for TV and stuff like that. So there is a new regime both in demand and the supply of collective decision thinking at that time. By means of a conclusion, here it is speculative. So I want your opinion on that. In spite of this, I kind of find that we have the impression that the economists' interest in collective decision making in the 80s, from the 80s onward, kind of fade. And we can't really explain why. The idea is that, well, of course, economic thinking about the outcome of coordination process can be thought in terms of collective decision, but economists don't think about the process of collective decision anymore. Questions like whose choice it is, whose value it is, are not there at the forefront of economics in the 80s. You can see, for instance, this in public economics. If you take, for instance, Atkinson and Stiglitz's textbook, that is the most used textbook in the 80s to teach public economics. You have middle chapters that are about positive and normative collective decision making, but the practice of it is about taking a collective, a social choice function that is defined exogenously and then optimize with it. So basically, collective decision is kind of being pushed outside public economics, and social choice is being marginalized. It's becoming more difficult to publish about Arrovian kind of theory in econometrica. So Hugo Schonenstein is very explicit about that. So social choice theories create social choice and welfare, and this is kind of pushed on the side. So maybe this is my conclusion question is, do you construe quadratic voting as the continuation of a tradition or a renewal? In the case of a renewal, why is there such an upsurge of interest in collective decision now? Thank you.